The salt flats of Lake Torrens do not reflect the sky so much as they erase it, turning the horizon into a seamless, blinding void of white clay and dry heat. In the winter of 1967, Arthur Vance stood on this expanse with a wild T2 theodolite, an optical instrument of Swiss precision, finished in a pale military green enamel. Arthur was 62 years old, a senior metrologist for the weapons research establishment, and his career was built on the cold mathematics of tracking things that were moving away from him. Usually those things were British-made blue steel missiles and sounding rockets, tearing through the upper atmosphere at 3,000 miles per hour. Today, however, his target was far more deliberate. He was tracking his junior assistant, a young surveyor named Donald, who was walking due north across the white crust with a red wooden leveling rod held over his shoulder. Through the eyepiece of the theodolite, Arthur could see the heat distortion beginning to crawl across the salt. It was only 10 in the morning, but the Australian sun was already cooking the clay pan, creating a thin, unstable boundary layer of hot air just inches above the ground. In the language of optics, this layer acts as a negative lens, bending light rays upward and making distant objects appear to float, stretch, or dissolve. Arthur adjusted the micrometer, reading the glass circle inside the instrument down to a single second of arc. He watched Donald's boots. At 1,000 yards, they were clear, black leather shapes cutting through the salt. At 1,500 yards, the boots became soft, their edges blending with the white glare. Arthur knew the physics of what was happening. He knew that human vision is not an infinite thread, but a biological grid with a very specific, unyielding boundary. At the center of the human eye lies the fovea centralis, a tiny pit packed with roughly 150,000 cone photoreceptors per square millimeter. This is the only part of our visual system capable of high-resolution detail. But the cones have a physical limit. For a person with perfect vision, the minimum angle of resolution is exactly 1 arc minute, which is 1/60th of a single degree of our visual field. This geometric constraint means that an object of a certain height can only be resolved as a distinct shape up to a very specific distance. For a human being standing 5 feet and 9 inches tall, that physical boundary is precisely 2,060 meters. At 2,061 meters, the geometry of the eye fails. The light from the head and the light from the feet land on the same receptor cell. The person does not simply look smaller, they cease to be a shape at all. They become a single, indivisible point of light, a dot. Arthur watched Donald reach the 2-kilometer stake, which had been driven into the salt like a lonely toothpick. Through the lens, Donald was no longer a young man from Adelaide with a fondness for cheap tobacco and brass band music. He was a gray blemish, a minor impurity in the crystalline white of the lake. He was a dot that had reached the absolute boundary of human resolution. Had Donald stood perfectly still, he would have remained indistinguishable from a dry clump of saltbush or a shadow in the clay. But then, Donald did what every human being does when they reach the edge of distance. He turned, raised his right hand, and began to wave. He moved his arm back and forth in a wide, deliberate arc at a rate of roughly 2 cycles per second. 2 Hertz. In Arthur's eye, a different system took over. While the fovea centralis at the center of the retina is designed for detail, the surrounding area of the retina is dominated by magnocellular pathways. These cells are blind to color and detail, but they are incredibly sensitive to temporal frequency, to changes in light and contrast over time. A human hand moving at 2 Hertz is a biological transmitter. It does not need to be resolved as a hand. It only needs to be registered as a pulse. By waving, Donald had bypassed the 1 arc minute limit of Arthur's fovea, activating the motion-sensitive neurons in his peripheral vision. Through this simple, rhythmic movement, Donald remained visible for another 700 yards past the point where his body had mathematically dissolved into the background. Arthur noted the distance in his red oilskin logbook. 2,740 yards before the signal was lost to the atmospheric noise. He closed the book and tightened the brass locking screws on the theodolite. He had his data. But as he stood on the salt flat, listening to the dry wind rattle the legs of his wooden tripod, his mind did not stay with the survey. It traveled 50 miles south to the Pimba railway platform, where 3 weeks later he would stand and watch his daughter, Clara, board the passenger train to Adelaide, the first leg of a journey that would take her to the other side of the world. The Pimba siding was nothing more than a corrugated iron shelter and a rusted water column along the Trans-Australian Railway. On the morning of Clara's departure, the sky was the color of lead, and the wind carried the smell of coal smoke and wet wool. Clara's suitcases were made of green vulcanized fiber, bound with leather straps that had stretched and frayed at the buckles. She was 24, and she was leaving the desert for a teaching post in a gray city she had only seen in library books. Arthur stood beside her on the gravel, his hands deep in the pockets of his heavy wool coat. His thumb was resting on the cold, knurled wheel of a brass stopwatch he had taken from the laboratory. They did not speak much. In the Vance family, feelings were treated like high-voltage equipment, best kept behind insulated panels and measured only through indirect indicators. Clara looked out at the vast red and gray expanse of saltbush that stretched to the horizon, then back at her father's quiet face. When the blue and yellow diesel locomotive let out its long hydraulic sigh, she climbed the steel steps of the carriage. She did not look back from the door. Instead, she walked down the narrow corridor to her compartment, slid open the rectangular glass window and leaned out. As the train began to move, its metal joints screaming against the cold rails, Arthur did not wave immediately. He reached into his pocket and pressed the crown of the stopwatch. One click. The tiny mechanical escapement began its rapid metallic chatter against his palm. The train gained speed, its mustard yellow tail car shrinking down the single line of steel that divided the desert. Clara's face was a pale oval against the dark metal of the carriage. She raised her hand and began to wave. Arthur waved back. He did not wave with the quick, fluttery gesture of the other travelers on the platform. He waved with the steady, measured rhythm he had calculated on the salt flats. Left, right. Left, right. 2 Hertz. He kept his arm moving in a precise arc, a steady metronome against the gray sky. In his pocket, the stopwatch ticked through the seconds. 60, 100, 140. At 90 seconds, the train was nearly a mile away. To any ordinary observer, Clara was already gone, her form swallowed by the gray mass of the passenger cars. But Arthur knew his eyes. He knew that his brain was no longer seeing the individual fingers of her hand or the dark wool of her sleeve. His visual cortex was performing a complex calculation, taking the tiny, low-frequency pulse of her moving hand and projecting his memory of her onto the empty pixels. He was not seeing his daughter. He was seeing his expectation of her. He was holding her in his mind through a collaborative hack of biology and affection. But as the stopwatch neared 200 seconds, Arthur's mind was pulled back to a different platform, 15 years earlier. It was 1952, on a gravel road outside the port town of Augusta. His wife, Eleanor, had sat in the passenger cabin of a commercial transport truck, her wooden crates of books and china secured under a canvas tarp in the back. Their parting had not been violent. It had been a quiet, mutual evaporation. the slow realization that they had become invisible to one another, even while sharing the same kitchen. He had stood by the concrete base of a stock bore, holding his handheld surveyor's glass to his eye, watching the truck climb the long red ridge. He had seen Eleanor's arm raised from the passenger window, waving through the dust. But as the truck neared the crest of the hill, a thick plume of red road silt had risen from the tires, enveloping the vehicle in a warm orange cloud. Through the lens of his glass, the dust was a solid screen, refracting the afternoon sun into a blinding glare. Arthur had waited. He had watched the orange wall for 5 seconds, then 10. When the truck did not emerge, and the motion vanished from his lens, he assumed she had lowered her hand, or that the vehicle had cleared the ridge. He had lowered his glass, slipped it into its leather case, and walked back to his utility truck. He had accepted the end of the signal. It was only 3 years later, during a series of light-scattering experiments at the Woomera Range, that he realized his mistake. He had been calculating the transmission of light through airborne particulates of various diameters. Red desert dust, with an average grain size of 5 microns, does not block light. It scatters it, acting as a low-pass filter. It dampens high-frequency spatial details, like the shape of a truck or the outline of a window. But it allows low-frequency, rhythmic motion to pass through almost unimpeded. If Eleanor had been waving at her usual hurried, nervous pace, her hand would have been invisible. But if she had kept her hand moving in a wide, slow arc, the frequency of her farewell would have cut through the red dust for another half-mile. She had not stopped waving. She had kept her hand moving through the orange glare, sending her signal into the blankness, operating under the belief that he was still standing by the stock bore, returning the pulse. She had waved into an empty road because she trusted that he would keep looking. But Arthur had trusted his eyes. He had trusted the silence of his lens. He had lowered his hand because he did not understand that the end of sight is not the end of the message. It is simply the point where the transmitter must work harder. On the Pimba platform, the stopwatch in Arthur's pocket clicked past 210 seconds. The train was now a tiny, dark stroke on the horizon, nearly 2,200 meters away. By every law of optical physics, Clara had crossed the 1 arc-minute barrier. She was no longer a person. She was a single gray point of light, hovering just above the salt bush before the tracks curved away into the low scrub of the tablelands. Arthur did not lower his arm. He stood on the edge of the weathered timber planks, his face turned toward the northwest. The other families had already walked back to their cars, their engines starting with a distant metallic cough. The platform speaker hummed with static, then fell silent. Arthur raised his right hand higher, fingers spread wide to create the largest possible surface area against the gray sky, and moved it. Left, right. Left, right. 2 hertz. He knew that if Clara was looking back through the small glass portal of the tail car, her fovea could not resolve him. To her, the Pimba station was a dark line, and he was nothing but an atom of dust against the rusted water tank. But he knew that her brain was built like his. He knew that her peripheral vision, her magnocellular cells, were still scanning the platform, searching not for a father, but for a frequency. He knew that if he kept his hand moving at exactly 2 cycles per second, he could pierce the 2-kilometer barrier. He could remain real to her for another 30 seconds, another 50 seconds, before the physical curvature of the earth finally took the train below the horizon. The desert wind blew hard across the gravel, lifting a thin veil of white dust from the dry lake bed. Arthur stood alone on the timber, his hands swinging through the cold air like a pendulum, ticking out his small, private rebellion against the geometry of the earth. He did not stop until the stopwatch in his pocket reached 300 seconds, when he knew the train had cleared the gap at Lake Hart and entered the deep scrub where no amount of motion could save them. Only then did he slide his hand back into his pocket, press the crown to stop the brass gears, and walk back to his car.